Alright y'all, welcome back to Common Arms channel. So today we're doing another reaction to ancient warriors. Now I know previously we did the Spartans, and when you're talking about ancient warriors, there's a few that come to mind, and the samurai are definitely another big ancient warrior that we like to talk about. So again, Spartans, samurai, medieval knights. These are very common. These are very popular, and everyone pretty much knows a little bit about them. So I don't know exactly when they existed. I think it was generally around the 17th to the 19th century. But yeah, everyone knows who they are, and if they don't know who they are, they definitely know what they used. So the katana is a very famous weapon used by the samurai, and their armor is also very distinct. You can't really compare it to anything. You can't really compare it to knight armor or Spartan armor, or even what like the legionnaires wore, and that's probably because of like their geographical location, just being where they're from, and the style and whatnot. Now I'm pretty sure the samurai are from Japan. When you think of samurai, that's usually what you think about. You think about like Japanese culture and whatnot. I'm not sure if they existed on any other continents or in any other countries, so hopefully this video will shed some light on it. But yeah, I think I know pretty much what most people would know. I know the samurai used a bunch of different weapons, not just the katana. The spear was also a very popular weapon. I would say the spear is the most popular weapon when we're talking about ancient weapons. But yeah, hopefully this video will shed a little bit of light on who the samurai were and whatnot. But this is an awesome YouTube channel. It's called Kings and Generals. And they do a lot of cool videos like this, so I'm sure it should be pretty solid. But again, if you guys aren't subscribed, definitely hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you're notified when I upload the next video in this series or any other reaction videos. I think the video about the Spartans was pretty cool, so you can go check that out. But this one should be good. I'm excited to learn a little bit more about the samurai, so let's do it. This is a solid intro.
Paragons of virtue, exemplars of honor, beacons of integrity, and masters of warfare, the Knights of the East. This is what we generally picture when we think of the infamous samurai. While it is an attractive view of these legendary warriors, it is nevertheless quite a misleading one. In this video, we shall do our best to correct this and cover the even more fascinating roles and perceptions of the samurai in Japanese society from the earliest days all the way to the modern day.
Awesome.
The geographical situation that spawned the samurai where they did is a unique one in the world. The Japanese home islands are an archipelago just off the Korean peninsula and the Asian mainland, leading German advisor Jakob Meckel in the Meiji Restoration period to remark that Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. Despite this divide, the superpower of the region, China, has influenced Japan more than any other nation, and the relationship between the two has had a massive impact on history. The position of Japanese emperor itself may have been adopted from China.
So I'll say, like, immediately when you're talking about like history of Asia in general, when you're talking about China, Korea, Japan, there's a whole lot that people don't know and people don't even teach. So I know in the U.S. obviously we don't go really in depth with the history of Asia. So like the history of how Japan was started and how Korea became into existence, I would imagine that China just came first just because it's the most prevalent, but I honestly have no idea. So when you're talking about Asian history, there's definitely a lot that could be learned. I'm not sure if it's the same in other parts of the world, if in the United Kingdom or if like in the Scandinavian countries, if they learn a little bit about what the United States is doing or what Asia is doing. I'm not really sure. So if y'all could provide some context as to how educated y'all actually get as far as geographical history and history of the world, definitely let me know, because I'm pretty much going with a blank slate on this one. I don't really know a whole lot about their history.
Proto-Japanese state of the early Heian period thrust north with an army based mainly on the Chinese heavy infantry model of the Tang dynasty. Eventually, however, they came upon the Emishi, or hairy people, of northeastern Honshu.
It's not very flattering.
This group had developed horse archery tactics similar to those of the Huns and Mongols. The immobile early Japanese could not deal with these irregular guerrilla tactics, so eventually their tactics were adopted by the Heian and the Emishi were gradually assimilated. This resilient group had a profound impact on the formation of the first samurai, and it has been said that the very core of the Japanese spirit is the ghost of the Emishi. As the Heian Japanese began to subjugate the Emishi at the end of the 8th century, many families of this group created a network of semi-autonomous feudal domains who would become the first samurai, literally translated as servant or henchman. They were
Now that's different from what I was thinking, because when I think of like the samurai, I think of like, you know, they're almost like privileged, or they're like the royal, important people that get put into this, you know, high honor of being a samurai. Because I remember, you know, back in the day when I was, you know, watching the documentaries and whatnot, you hear about the ninjas, and the ninjas were going against the samurai, and the ninjas were sort of like the farmers and whatnots, and they were sort of like the servants that were trying to fight the samurai. So I'm not sure where that divide actually came from, or how accurate that actually is. So again, if you guys could educate me on that. I'm not trying to spread fake news here, but that was my interpretation, that the samurai were much more important, and then you have like the henchmen who didn't have the same armor or katanas or anything like that. So maybe they started off as like the servants or henchmen, and then they sort of built up from there, but maybe this video will shed some more light on that.
This name by warriors in the Heian capital who sought to distinguish themselves from the unsophisticated louts in the provinces. This is one of the first misconceptions of the samurai that must be corrected. They were not just katana-wielding swordsmen with fancy armor. It is likely that the very first proto-samurai were in fact these same rural Emishi horse archers which the emperors came to favor in suppressing internal unrest. As the Heian period continued, the central government in modern Kyoto became less and less interested in actually running the country. This allowed the samurai to become more independent and entrenched, and allowed them to gain more power. Eventually, a series of revolts occurred, and members of the samurai class took control of the country, establishing the Kamakura Shogunate, the first shogunate in Japanese history.
So here's mentioned the shogunate. I think that's what he said, or how he pronounced it. But I wonder what that would be compared to with today's military. Obviously, it's completely different. You know, there's different technology, there's different formations, different tactics and whatnot. But I wonder what would be the closest comparison to that. But I know, like, when you hear of shogun, that's like the higher ranking or whatever. That's like one of the important people. So it seems like there's like a bunch of different shogunates, or whatever he was saying. There's a bunch of different ones on the actual continent, or in Japan. So it gets very confusing. But I guess back then everything was sort of like a land grab or a power grab, so it's a lot harder to track down everything and make sense of everything. But just trying to break them down and go to the history of each one, you could probably spend a lot of time on that. So that's pretty crazy how it just transformed constantly. It was like a fluid environment back then almost.
A shogun was technically a high-ranking samurai ruling in the emperor's name, but in reality they were the military dictator, while the emperor was just a figurehead. Sometimes in Japanese history, however, even the shogun was a puppet ruler, and the actual holders of influence were the powerful feudal landholders, or the daimyo. During the Kamakura era, the Japanese state came under severe threat. The Yuan Empire under Kublai Khan launched 2 invasions of Japan, and the samurai were itching for a fight. In both circumstances, the samurai used unconventional tactics to hinder their enemy. They drove boats full of burning pitch into the Mongol ships, and launched constant suicide attacks. Eventually, 2 hurricanes destroyed the Mongol fleets, and Japan was saved.
That's another thing, like when you're talking about like ancient history or stuff back in the day, like you'll be so surprised how many times this crazy storm will come out of nowhere and wipe out like an entire fleet. Like, I don't know why, whenever I'm like reading up on history and whatnot, that pops up more than you would think, I guess. But that's cool to see that they were using unconventional tactics. Now, I know comparing like with Japan in World War II, they had a bunch of unconventional tactics, and it served them well at some times, and then didn't serve them well in other times. So it's kind of interesting to see how these nuanced tactics would sort of persist a certain period of time. But you can imagine they're pretty effective when you're talking about like guerrilla warfare and whatnot. They can definitely be effective against conventional warfare. People like to use conventional tactics and whatnot for, just because they're safe and they're generally effective. But when you have someone who knows how to utilize guerrilla warfare a certain way, it can definitely be pretty formidable and just leave people in a certain state of shock because the battlefield becomes so fluid and everything's changing so quickly.
The samurai have often been seen as the Eastern mirror image of the knights in medieval Europe due to their code of conduct and seemingly elite nature. But unlike knights, samurai usually comprised a dominant number of troops in feudal Japanese armies compared to the relatively small number of knights in European armies.
That's a good
which
distinction.
Were often filled with enlisted men-at-arms or peasants. This was the case in the Mongol invasions, as almost the entire Japanese army consisted of samurai. Nevertheless, these wars with the Mongols had weakened the Kamakura, and the first shogunate fell not long after. After more political maneuvering and an attempted imperial restoration, the Ashikaga shogunate eventually came to power in 1338. Never as powerful as their Kamakura predecessors, the Ashikaga slowly began to lose their hold on local daimyos, and
Okay, so yeah, we're pretty much completely wrong about the timelines of the samurai. They're definitely a lot older than I thought, at least. I would say we were wrong. I was wrong. It was definitely a lot older than I thought. So, alrighty, we're learning a lot of good stuff. So this is good. This is why we come to these kinds of videos.
when a samurai feud for Kyoto began between the Hosokawa and Yamana in 1467, the shogunate effectively lost all control over the provinces. One of the most famous eras in samurai history, the Sengoku Jidai, was about to begin. By the end of the Onin War, Japan was essentially split into hundreds of separate feudal domains ruled by their daimyos, literally great names. Many of the common myths and legends about the samurai took root during this era, and likely did happen, but only in certain places and at certain times. This was the golden age of samurai warfare, and one of the periods that later samurai would look back on, romanticize, and attempt to emulate.
Okay, so hopefully he goes over some of those misconceptions, because again, when people think about samurai, they like to dramatize everything and you know, romanticize it. So it should be interesting to see those misconceptions, because I definitely have a certain view of the samurai. It might change. I'm not sure how accurate the movies and video games were, where I got that idea of the samurai. But yeah, hopefully he goes over some of the misconceptions. But I guess this is one of the more popular eras in the samurai history.
Elate. Honor was common, as was deceit. A contest between two famous warlords is an example of the former. Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen had a rivalry which, unlike many of the more cutthroat conflicts during this time, was more like an annual competition between sophisticated gentlemen. They would meet at the same place every year to battle one another, and then go back home. On one occasion, when another clan disrupted the Takeda's salt supplies, Kenshin sent his own as a replacement. He stated courteously that he chose to fight his adversaries with swords and not salt. As the 16th century progressed, this kind of gentlemanly conduct became less and less common. European traders in the south of Japan had introduced early firearms, such as the arquebus. While the Japanese were not unfamiliar with gunpowder, this new technology changed the battlefield dramatically.
Okay, again, that's something right there. I would never have pictured samurai using anything with gunpowder, which is kind of weird because, again, they did last, up until the 1800s, I believe, maybe even 1900s. But yeah, I never even pictured them with weapons with gunpowder. I guess it's pretty crazy to think about, but you just sort of picture them with like bows and arrows and swords and spears and whatnot. So already that's a big shock in my mind. The fact that they had these sort of weapons, which makes sense.
Another common misconception, popularized by films such as The Last Samurai, is that samurai did not adopt firearms because they were viewed as dishonorable. Some Japanese were indeed shocked by the new weapons, viewing them as impractical and ineffective rather than dishonorable. However, most daimyo who could buy them did, and experienced success because of it. The aforementioned Takeda Shingen bought 300 of them before his yearly battle against Uesugi Kenshin in 1571. Nor did samurai restrain themselves from even the worst kinds of betrayal in situations where it could benefit them, in contrast to their popular portrayal as paragons of truthfulness and honesty. As Oda Nobunaga was on his way to conquering Japan and possibly unifying it, he was betrayed by a seemingly loyal general, Akechi Mitsuhide, who claimed the title of shogun for himself. Many reasons have been speculated upon for this act, but many believe Mitsuhide had a grievance against his treatment by Nobunaga, who was trapped and committed suicide, while Mitsuhide was killed a few months later when Oda's allies returned to deal with the traitor.
Yeah, so I definitely did think of like the samurai as being honorable and whatnot. Like I know they have like I guess like a ceremony. I don't even know if this is accurate, but it's like seppuku, where they'll get like a dishonor or something, and they'll end up stabbing themselves in the stomach with their sword. I don't know if that's like an actual tradition or something that they actually practiced back then, but that's something that came to mind when you're talking about like honor and whatnot. That's something I was thinking about with the samurai, where they would rather die than go. Like death before dishonor is a big motto, and I think, or at least I thought that originated from like the samurai or someone in that era. But yeah, you can imagine there's gonna be a whole lot of weird betrayals when you're talking about like this weird power balance between like the shoguns and then like the emperor, and all of a sudden like you have all these other little factions and whatnot involved. So you can imagine there was a lot of betrayals and mistrust back in the day when you're talking about stuff like that. But yeah, I mean it's nice to sort of shed light on that, because again when you're talking about like knights, at least they're like super honorable and whatnot, and I'm sure there's a lot of instances where a lot of knights weren't so honorable. So maybe we'll have to do a video about them after the samurai. But yeah, it's cool learning this stuff. It definitely takes some of the luster off of their appearance and whatnot, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara and unified Japan under the Tokugawa Shogunate. The sudden cessation of warfare in the country left the martial samurai class with little to occupy their time. They were solidified as a hereditary class, and gradually began to find work as clerks in their lord's storehouses, night watchmen, tax collectors, security guards, courtiers and administrators, all the while still dressed for the battlefields of old, a symbolic mark of prestige. They essentially began to occupy positions in what we would call the civil service of the shogunate. In stark contrast to their formerly austere nature, some samurai during the peaceful Tokugawa era began having extravagant swords created which they could not possibly hope to wield in combat, and started to wear their hair in outlandish bouffants. While the warrior ethos of Bushido remained, the actual samurai began to lose their military training and became a symbol of Japan's past rather than the protectors of its future.
So there's definitely a lot of things that can relate to that. When you're talking about your history and your military history especially, there's a certain appearance that a lot of units will have that just tend to fade or change just based off their relevancy. It'll change. So it's cool to see how the samurai were actually doing that. Again, you start talking about like how some people will stick to their title so much that they'll start to have like an ego with it essentially. So you can see they were having like these extravagant swords crafted and whatnot. They're wearing their hair in a style that you wouldn't necessarily dress it for combat. So it's cool to see these changes happening where the relevancy shifts from being like combat effective and sticking with the the Bushido mindset to just being like a sort of like a symbol. So it's definitely cool to see how that transfer actually takes place.
To match their new civil roles, Bushido was gradually modified to include values such as etiquette and politeness, which would serve them well in their bureaucratic occupations.
Makes sense.
Their martial training generally continued throughout the era, but it was more of an art form rather than preparation for real battle. Practical battle training and weaponry were sidelined in favor of styles such as kendo, the way of the sword. It is from this development that the katana-wielding samurai was popularized, in contrast to the actual, practical ways in which they fought earlier battles, such as those at Sekigahara and against the Mongols. In this period, agriculture became less of a crucial aspect to the Japanese economy. Because of this, the stipend that the samurai were paid by the state began to stagnate and decrease. This caused animosity between samurai and the rising merchant class, who began to get rich from the changes in the social system. This trend continued into the late Tokugawa period and only got worse, to the extent where many of the poorer samurai were on the level of peasants in terms of wealth. This led to unrest among the samurai class, and eventually masterless samurai, known as ronin, increasingly became skilled bandits in order to make more money.
So when you're talking about like ronin back in the day, well, a lot of people now would think about ronin from like Call of Duty, the dude who does all like the tactical training videos and whatnot. But when you're talking about the ronin back in the day, I'm sure it was cool to have like that sort of dynamic where you have these warriors who are very proud. They had all this training and they had this image, who are moving on to be like a soldier for hire almost. I'm sure it was a pretty interesting dynamic to see how that actually fit in with everything as far as assigning people a job or a mission to do something, especially when you're talking about like mercenary style work or what have you. Then it starts getting almost illegal to do certain things. So I'm sure it was weird. Their dynamic definitely shifted a lot when they started doing the ronin stuff, I bet.
Eventually, under pressure from outside powers, the Tokugawa shogunate was replaced by the Japanese Empire, and the samurai were essentially sidelined. The fact that the samurai of old now no longer existed only fueled further misconceptions and romanticism, and this allowed the new Japanese nation to warp and twist Bushido into a philosophy that was used to signify a good citizen. The intensity that these new values created in the new nation of Japan burned white hot until the Second World War and the nuclear attacks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yikes.
After the subsequent surrender, Bushido was reconsidered and became more of a historical monument. Notably, however, the Japanese are still seen as a dedicated people when it comes to business and industry. Even in the modern day, the legacy of the samurai is clear and present in the land of the rising sun. This has been our video on the history, perceptions and reality of the samurai throughout Japanese history.
Okay, yeah, that was a very good point, how he's saying, when it sort of shifts, a lot of times people will keep not necessarily the mentality of the samurai, but keeping sort of like the philosophy of the samurai, at least the romanticized parts as far as like the morals and ethics, and using that to more modern effect. So it's cool how that actually happens. Now you'll see certain shifts like that, with like martial arts. So martial arts might have started initially as a combat, a combat style. So people are using swords and weapons and fighting with their hands for close quarter combat. That was actually a form of warfare back in the day. And then they sort of transitioned to like a self-defense sort of dynamic, or like even like a discipline building dynamic. And then even sometimes they'll be like an art form. So martial arts can be seen as art a lot of times. So it's weird how you'll see these shifts, and it's cool to see how they actually transform into other things and remain relevant and pertinent for other facets of modern lifestyle. So yeah, it's very cool to see that. And you don't really see that dynamic with everything. like with the Spartans, you can sort of see that sort of mindsets of having a warrior culture. But at the same time, when you think of the Spartans, a lot of times people will just have like their helmets plastered over all this stuff. Like, oh yeah, I'm a warrior, I'll put a Spartan helmet on that. At least in the United States, you'll see Spartan helmets all over the place, like patches and whatnot made. And yeah, it's cool, but it gets kind of cringy, and it's not really what the Spartans actually stood for. So it doesn't necessarily work out like that all the time. But yeah, if we're looking at these like other ancient warriors, we can sort of see that dynamic. It'd be pretty cool. But yeah, the knights, I'm sure that would be an interesting transition to talk about. But yeah, if you guys have any recommendations for ancient warriors, definitely feel free to put that in the comments section. Again, it's cool to see how their relevancy sort of shifts, or see how, maybe they just didn't become relevant because they didn't stick up with the technology and whatnot. Seems like the samurai were sticking up with technology and it worked for them. But that might be the downfall of some military units and whatnot. But definitely comment and let me know what you guys think about the video itself. You can get very philosophical about this sort of stuff, about ancient warriors and ancient warfare and how it can relate today. It's very cool to talk about. But yeah, definitely let me know what you think in the comments section. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I definitely enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed learning a little bit more about the samurai. But that is it for this video, so I will see y'all in the next one.